When I returned home from major abdominal surgery, barely able to stand without pain, and my own daughter screamed, "We are not your servants," just because I asked for a glass of water, I knew something had to change. What happened next didn't just shock my ungrateful daughter and her lazy husband. It stripped away everything they thought they owned and left them scrambling to understand how the mother they'd been treating like garbage had just reclaimed her power in the most brutal way possible. But before we dive into this incredible story of how one mother's surgical recovery became the perfect opportunity for the most satisfying revenge, smash that like button if you love seeing justice served to ungrateful family members. Subscribe for more revenge stories that will leave you speechless, and comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. My name is Dorothy Hayes, and at 68 years old, I thought I had done everything right as a mother. For the past 30 years, I had poured my heart, soul, and savings into raising my daughter Emily, believing that love and sacrifice would create the kind of family bond that could weather any storm. Looking back now, I realize I was naive to think that giving someone everything they wanted would automatically make them grateful. Emily was my only child, the center of my universe after her father, my beloved husband Robert, passed away from a sudden heart attack when she was just 16. Robert's death didn't just leave us emotionally devastated. It left us financially struggling until his life insurance policy came through 6 months later. That $550,000 check felt like a lifeline, a final gift from the man who had always promised to take care of us even after he was gone. Instead of using that money for myself, traveling, buying a smaller place, securing my own retirement, I made the decision to invest it all in Emily's future. I paid for her college education in full, covering not just tuition, but her apartment, meal plans, study abroad program in Italy, and even the brand new car she insisted she needed for her internship. When she graduated with a degree in marketing and immediately fell in love with Brandon, a charming but chronically unemployed musician, I bit my tongue and supported their relationship. Brandon was the kind of man who had big dreams, but little follow-through. He talked constantly about his next big break in the music industry, about the band that was going to make it, about the recording studio he was going to open someday. But what he actually did was work part-time at a guitar shop while Emily supported them both with her entry-level marketing job. Still, Emily seemed happy, and I had learned long ago that sometimes supporting your child means supporting their choices, even when you have doubts. When they decided to get married, I didn't hesitate to cover the $35,000 wedding cost. Emily wanted everything perfect: the elegant venue, the designer dress, the destination honeymoon in Greece. Brandon's family contributed virtually nothing, claiming financial hardship, so I stepped in to make sure my daughter had the wedding of her dreams. I watched her walk down the aisle in that beautiful dress, radiating joy, and I felt proud that I could give her this moment. But the requests for help didn't stop after the wedding. Brandon's music career continued its stagnating, and his various business ventures, a food truck that never got off the ground, an online music lesson platform that attracted exactly 3 students, and a vintage guitar resale business that somehow lost money, all seemed to require my financial intervention. Emily would call me with carefully rehearsed speeches about temporary setbacks and investment opportunities, and I would transfer money into their account because I couldn't bear to see my daughter struggle. When their apartment rent increased and they complained about not being able to find anything affordable in their area, I made what I thought was a generous and practical decision. I used the remaining insurance money to buy them a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a good neighborhood, complete with a large yard and updated kitchen that Emily had always dreamed of having. I thought it would give them stability, a place to build their life together, maybe start a family of their own someday. The house cost me $380,000, nearly depleting what remained of Robert's life insurance. But seeing Emily's face when I handed her the keys, the tears of joy, the tight hug, and whispered thank you against my shoulder made every penny feel worth it. I kept a small apartment for myself across town, telling myself that I was still young enough to rebuild my savings, that my reward was knowing Emily was secure and happy. For 5 years, this arrangement seemed to work beautifully. Emily and Brandon settled into the house, and while Brandon's career continued its pattern of fits and starts, they seemed content. Emily got promoted at her job, they adopted a rescue dog, and they talked occasionally about their future plans. I visited regularly, always welcomed with smiles and dinner invitations, feeling like the loving mother and grandmother in waiting that I had always wanted to be. But I began to notice subtle changes over time. My visits became less frequent as Emily grew busier with work and social commitments. When I did come over, conversations felt more superficial, focused on their needs and problems, rather than genuine interest in my life. They talked about home improvements they wanted to make, vacation plans that required saving money, Brandon's latest business idea that needed initial capital. The gratitude I remembered from those early years had slowly been replaced by something that felt more like expectation. Still, I told myself this was natural. Young couples needed space to build their own lives. It was healthy for Emily to become more independent, even if it meant I felt less central to her daily existence. I had my volunteer work at the animal shelter, my book club, my small circle of friends. I was building my own life too, trying not to be the clingy mother who couldn't let go. Then came the health scare that would change everything. It started with what I thought was simple indigestion. I had been having stomach pains for several weeks, the kind of discomfort that made me reach for antacids and tell myself it was just stress or maybe something I ate. But when the pain became sharp and persistent, accompanied by nausea and a strange bloated feeling that wouldn't go away, I finally made an appointment with my doctor. Dr. Martinez took one look at my symptoms and ordered an immediate CT scan. The results showed what appeared to be a large mass in my abdomen, wrapped around several vital organs in a way that made surgery both urgent and complicated. Within a week, I was scheduled for what the surgical team called an exploratory laparotomy with possible mass resection, medical terminology for cutting me open to see what was wrong and hopefully fix it. I called Emily to tell her about the surgery, trying to keep my voice steady despite my fear. The doctors had explained that while they hoped the mass was benign, they wouldn't know for certain until they could examine it directly. The surgery would involve a large abdominal incision, possible removal of part of my intestine, and a recovery period of several weeks. "Oh, wow, Mom, that sounds scary," Emily had said, though I could hear the TV in the background and sense that she was distracted. "When is it happening?" "Next Tuesday," I said. I know you're busy, but I was wondering if you might be able to come to the hospital, or maybe I could stay with you for a few days afterward. The doctor said I shouldn't be alone for the first week of recovery. There was a pause, and I heard her talking to Brandon in the background, their voices muffled as she apparently covered the phone. "Yeah, Mom, of course you can stay here while you recover. We'll take care of you." The relief I felt at those words was overwhelming. Despite the growing distance I had sensed between us, Emily was still my daughter, still willing to help when I truly needed her. I went into surgery the following Tuesday with her promise echoing in my mind, giving me strength during the most frightening medical experience of my life. The surgery took 4 hours. When I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented from anesthesia, the first thing I saw was Emily's face hovering over me. "Hey, Mom, you made it through. The doctor said it went well." Dr. Martinez explained later that they had successfully removed a large benign tumor that had been pressing against my intestines and causing my symptoms. The good news was that it wasn't cancerous. The challenging news was that the removal had required extensive abdominal surgery, leaving me with a 6-inch incision held together with surgical staples and strict instructions about my recovery. No lifting anything heavier than a coffee cup for 3 weeks. No driving until you're off to pain medication. lots of rest, gentle walking as tolerated, and absolutely no bending or twisting at the waist. Someone will need to help you with basic activities for at least the first week." Emily nodded along with the instructions, asked appropriate questions about wound care and warning signs to watch for, and even helped me into a wheelchair for the ride to her car. During the drive to what used to be my house, to the house I had bought for her, she chatted about how she had prepared the guest room for me, stocked up on groceries, and arranged to work from home for the first few days. I felt a warm glow of gratitude and love. Whatever distance had grown between us lately, my daughter was stepping up when I needed her most. She was going to take care of me the way I had always taken care of her. But that warm feeling began to fade almost as soon as we walked through the front door. The house looked exactly the same as when I had last visited, but somehow it felt different walking into it as someone who needed help rather than someone who was simply visiting. Emily showed me to the guest room, a room that had once been my temporary office when I was house hunting for them, now converted into a space that felt more like a hotel room than part of a family home. "I put fresh sheets on the bed," Emily said, setting my overnight bag on the dresser. "And there are towels in the bathroom. Brandon's working from home today too, so someone will always be around if you need anything." Brandon appeared in the doorway, giving me a casual wave. "Hey, Dorothy. Glad you're okay. That sounded like some serious surgery." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, easing myself carefully onto the edge of the bed. Even that simple movement sent sharp pains through my incision site, making me wince despite the pain medication I had taken that morning. "So," Emily said, checking her phone, "I've got a conference call in about an hour, but after that I'll be free to help with whatever you need. There's leftover soup in the fridge if you get hungry before dinner time." She disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone in the guest room, with Brandon, who seemed to be hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Do you need anything right now?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping the answer would be no. "Actually," I said, suddenly realizing how parched I felt, "could I trouble you for a glass of water? The pain medication makes me really thirsty, and I'm supposed to stay hydrated." Brandon glanced toward the kitchen, then back at me. "Sure, I guess. Just regular water?" "That would be perfect. Thank you so much." He returned a few minutes later with a plastic cup filled with lukewarm tap water, set it on the nightstand, and immediately headed for the door. "I'll be in the living room if you need anything else," he said, already halfway down the hall. I sipped the water and tried to settle into the bed, telling myself that this awkwardness was normal. Brandon had never been particularly nurturing or attentive, even during the best of times, and Emily was probably just busy with work responsibilities she couldn't easily reschedule. Things would improve once we all adjusted to this temporary arrangement. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice that the care and attention Emily had promised seemed to exist more in theory than in practice. When I emerged from the guest room around dinner time, moving slowly and carefully to avoid jarring my incision, I found Emily and Brandon both in the living room, her on her laptop and he watching television with the volume turned up loud enough that they had to raise their voices to talk to each other. "How are you feeling, Mom?" Emily asked, without looking up from her screen. "Pretty sore," I admitted. "The doctor said that's normal for the first few days, but it's definitely challenging to move around much." "Mm-hmm," she murmured, still typing. "That's good that it's normal." I waited for her to close the laptop, to suggest we figure out dinner plans or ask if I needed help with anything. Instead, she continued working while Brandon channel surfed, both of them seemingly absorbed in their own activities. I was thinking about dinner, I said, finally. Would you like me to try to make something, or did you have other plans? Emily finally looked up, surprise evident on her face. Mom, you just had major surgery yesterday. You shouldn't be cooking. You're right, I said, feeling relieved that she recognized my limitations. I was just wondering what we should do about dinner. Another pause, this one longer and more uncomfortable. Emily and Brandon exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite interpret. Well, Emily said slowly, we usually just order something or throw together whatever's in the fridge. Nothing fancy. You're welcome to have whatever we're having, of course. It was a perfectly reasonable response, but something about the tone felt off. There was no warmth in the invitation, no sense that they had given any thought to what might be appropriate for someone recovering from surgery. It felt more like they were informing me of their plans rather than including me in them. That sounds fine, I said. Could I maybe sit in the kitchen while you're getting things ready? It would be nice to have some company. Sure, Emily said, returning to her laptop. We'll probably figure something out in a little while. A little while turned into 2 hours. By 8 p.m., I was exhausted from trying to find a comfortable position in the guest room, nauseated from not eating since breakfast, and increasingly confused about the level of care I had been promised. When I finally ventured back into the kitchen, I found Emily and Brandon both in the living room, her on her laptop, and he watching television with the volume turned up loud enough that they had to raise their voices to talk to each other. Oh, Mom, she said, noticing me standing uncertainly in the doorway. Are you hungry? There's probably enough here for you too if you want some. She gestured vaguely toward the containers on the counter, making no move to prepare a plate for me or even to explain what the leftovers were. I stood there for a moment, processing the realization that I was expected to serve myself despite being barely 24 hours out of major abdominal surgery. Could you help me make a plate? I asked quietly. I'm having trouble reaching and bending. Emily sighed audibly, set down her own plate, and assembled a small portion of fried rice and sweet and sour chicken on a paper plate. Handed it to me without offering to warm it up or asking if I wanted something to drink with it. Thank you, honey, I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. This was not the recovery period I had envisioned. The next morning brought new challenges, and the first real indication of how dramatically my relationship with Emily and Brandon had shifted. I woke up around 6 a.m., not by choice, because the pain medication had worn off, and my incision site was throbbing. According to my discharge instructions, I could take another dose of pain medication, but I needed to take it with food to avoid stomach upset. I made my way slowly to the kitchen, hoping to find something simple I could manage on my own, maybe toast or a banana, but every movement that involved reaching or bending sent sharp pains through my abdominal area. The bread was in a cabinet above the counter, the butter in the refrigerator at waist level, the plates in a cabinet I couldn't reach without stretching. Even the simple act of filling a glass with water required movements that my healing body wasn't ready to handle. After several painful attempts to reach what I needed, I gave up and returned to the guest room to wait for Emily and Brandon to wake up. I could ask for help then, maybe even suggest that we move a few essential items to places I could reach more easily during my recovery. But when Emily finally emerged from her bedroom around 9 o'clock, she seemed rushed and distracted, immediately focused on getting ready for a day of video conferences she apparently couldn't reschedule. Morning, Mom, she said, pouring coffee into a travel mug. How did you sleep? Not great, I admitted, The pain is pretty intense when the medication wears off, and I'm supposed to take it with food, but I'm having trouble reaching things in the kitchen. Emily paused in her morning routine, looking at me with what seemed like impatience. What do you need? Just something simple for breakfast, maybe toast or cereal, and I should probably take my medication. She glanced at her watch, then at Brandon, who was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone while eating a bowl of cereal. "Brandon, can you help Dorothy with breakfast?" she asked. Brandon looked up from his phone with obvious annoyance. "I'm about to leave for work." "Work?" Emily said, raising an eyebrow. "Since when do you leave for work at 9 a.m.? "I have a meeting with that guy about the recording studio space," Brandon said defensively. "I told you about it yesterday." Emily rolled her eyes but didn't pursue the argument. "Fine. Mom, there's bread in the cabinet above the coffee maker, and Brandon can reach it for you before he leaves." Brandon sighed dramatically, but stood up and retrieved the bread, dropping it on the counter with unnecessary force. "Anything else?" he asked, his tone making it clear that he hoped the answer was no. "Could I trouble you for a glass of water for my medication?" He filled a glass with tap water and set it beside the bread with the same reluctant energy. "There, toast and water. I really do have to go." He grabbed his keys and left without saying goodbye, leaving me standing in the kitchen with Emily, who was checking her phone while her coffee finished brewing. "The toaster is right there," Emily said, pointing to the counter, "and there's butter in the fridge. I've really got to get started on these calls, but you should be all set." She disappeared into her home office, leaving me alone in the kitchen to figure out how to make toast without bending, reaching, or putting pressure on my healing incision. It took me 20 minutes to complete what should have been a 5-minute task, and by the time I was done, I was exhausted and in considerable pain. But I told myself this was temporary. Emily and Brandon were both busy with work responsibilities, and they probably didn't fully understand the limitations I was dealing with. Once I healed a bit more, things would get easier. The rest of that day followed a similar pattern. Emily remained closeted in her office, emerging occasionally to grab a snack or use the bathroom, but showing little interest in checking on me or offering assistance. Brandon returned home around dinner time with takeout for himself and Emily, almost as an afterthought, mentioning that there was an extra container if I wanted some. By the third day, I was beginning to feel like an unwelcome house guest rather than a recovering patient staying with family. The pain medication made me drowsy, but I couldn't sleep comfortably because of the incision site. I was bored and lonely, spending most of my time in the guest room because I felt like I was intruding when I tried to spend time in the common areas of the house. But it was on the 4th day that the veneer of politeness finally cracked completely. I had been trying to be as self-sufficient as possible, not wanting to be a burden, but I was running low on the pain medication and needed someone to drive me to the pharmacy to pick up a refill. More immediately, I was desperately thirsty and had been lying in the guest room for over an hour, hoping the intense thirst would pass, but eventually realizing I needed to ask for help. Emily was in the living room, working on her laptop as usual, while Brandon watched television with the volume turned up unnecessarily loud. I approached them carefully, moving slowly to avoid jarring my incision. "Emily, honey, I'm really sorry to bother you, but could you ask you to bring me a glass of water? I'm having trouble getting to the kitchen today." Emily didn't look up from her laptop. "There's a bathroom right next to your room, Mom. You can drink from the tap." The suggestion was so dismissive, so completely lacking in care or consideration that I felt stunned. "I can't really bend over the sink very well," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "And the doctor said I should be drinking lots of water, not just sipping from the faucet." Emily paused, finally, looked up, and the expression on her face was nothing like the caring daughter who had promised to take care of me. There was irritation, resentment, and something that looked almost like disgust. "Mom," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance, "we are not your servants. You're not an invalid. It's just a little surgery. You can get your own water." The words hit me like a physical blow. After everything I'd done for her, after all the sacrifices I'd made, after giving her the very house she was sitting in, she was treating me like an inconvenience for asking for the most basic assistance while recovering from major surgery. But they had no idea that their cruel words had just awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. That moment in the living room was a turning point, but not in the way Emily and Brandon probably expected. Instead of retreating to the guest room in hurt silence, instead of making excuses for their behavior or trying harder to be the perfect, undemanding patient, I began to pay attention, really pay attention, to how they talked to me, how they treated me, and how they viewed my presence in their lives. What I discovered over the next few days was even worse than I had initially realized. Their cruelty wasn't just occasional thoughtlessness or stress-induced snappiness. It was systematic, deliberate, and designed to make me feel as unwelcome as possible without technically kicking me out. They had turned psychological manipulation into an art form, and I had been too naive, too trusting, and too focused on my own recovery to see it clearly. Emily would ask how I was feeling with a concerned expression, then immediately follow up with comments designed to minimize my experience. "Oh, that's too bad that you're still sore. My friend Jessica bounced back from her appendectomy in like 2 days, but everyone heals differently, I guess." The implication was always that I was being dramatic, that my pain wasn't as legitimate as I claimed, that I was somehow failing at recovery. Brandon was more direct in his contempt, but equally calculated. He would offer to help with something, then perform the task with such obvious reluctance and passive-aggressive commentary that I felt worse for asking than if I had struggled through it myself. "I guess I can drive you to the pharmacy," he would say, "but I had plans today. I hope this doesn't take forever." They began having conversations around me as if I weren't there, discussing their weekend plans, work problems, and social activities without any acknowledgement that I might be interested or able to contribute. When I tried to join these conversations, they would respond with polite but dismissive comments that made it clear my input wasn't welcome. But perhaps most telling was how they talked about my recovery timeline. "When do you think you'll be ready to go back to your apartment?" Emily asked on my 6th day there, while I was still taking prescription pain medication and unable to drive. "The doctor said I shouldn't be alone for at least 2 weeks, I reminded her, "and I can't drive until I'm off the pain medication." 2 weeks? Brandon said, looking up from his phone with undisguised dismay. "That seems like a really long time for stomach surgery." "It was major abdominal surgery," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "They removed a large tumor and had to repair intestinal damage." "Right," Emily said, in a tone that suggested she thought I was exaggerating. "Well, we'll just have to see how it goes." The subtext was clear. They wanted me gone as soon as possible, regardless of my medical needs or safety. But the moment that crystallized everything, the moment that made me understand exactly how they viewed me and our relationship, came on my 7th day in their house. I had been having a particularly difficult morning. The incision site was more painful than usual, I was feeling nauseated from the medication, and I was emotionally drained from days of feeling unwelcome in what had once been my own home. Around noon, I realized I hadn't eaten anything since the previous evening and probably needed food to help settle my stomach. I made my way slowly to the kitchen where Emily was making herself a sandwich for lunch. The kitchen smelled wonderful, fresh bread, turkey, that good mustard she liked, and I felt a small spark of hope that maybe she would offer to make me something too, or at least invite me to join her for lunch. "That looks delicious," I said, settling carefully into one of the kitchen chairs. "Thanks," Emily said, without looking up. I was really craving a good sandwich. She finished assembling her lunch, wrapped half of it in foil, and began gathering her things as if preparing to take her meal elsewhere. Emily, I said quietly, I know I've been asking for a lot of help, and I really appreciate everything you've done. I was wondering, would it be possible for you to make me a small sandwich too? I think I need to eat something, but I'm having trouble standing for very long. Emily stopped what she was doing and turned to face me with an expression I had never seen before. It was cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the love and warmth I had always associated with my daughter. Mom, you need to understand something. Brandon and I have our own lives, our own responsibilities, our own needs. We can't drop everything to wait on you hand and foot just because you decided to have surgery. The accusation stung, as if I had chosen to have a tumor, as if I had scheduled major surgery as some kind of inconvenience to their lives. I'm not asking you to wait on me hand and foot, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm asking for help making a sandwich because I can barely stand up for very long. And I'm telling you that you need to figure out how to take care of yourself. We are not your servants. We are not your caregivers. We are not responsible for managing your recovery. Brandon appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the raised voices. Instead of trying to de-escalate the situation or show any concern for my obvious distress, he nodded approvingly at Emily's words. She's right, Dorothy. You can't expect us to drop everything because you're milking this whole surgery thing. Milking it, as if I were faking my pain, exaggerating my limitations, manipulating them for attention. I'm not milking anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm recovering from major surgery, and I was told I would need help for a few weeks. A few weeks? Emily laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mom, you've been here a week already. How much longer do you think this is going to go on? The doctor said. The doctor doesn't have to live with you. The doctor doesn't have to listen to you complain about every little ache and pain. I sat in that kitchen chair, staring at these two people who owed their entire comfortable existence to my sacrifice and generosity, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about poor bedside manner or stress-induced irritability. This was about who they really were beneath the surface gratitude and family obligations. They saw me as a burden. They saw my recovery as an inconvenience. They saw my needs as impositions on their time and energy. And most importantly, they had forgotten, or simply didn't care, that everything they had, everything they enjoyed, everything that made their comfortable life possible had come from me. It was time to remind them. That night, lying in the guest room bed staring at the ceiling while Emily and Brandon watched movies in the living room without any concern for whether I might want to join them, I began to think about the legal documents that had made their comfortable life possible. 5 years earlier, when I had decided to buy them the house, my lawyer, Susan Delaney, had been very thorough about protecting my interests while still accomplishing my goal of providing for Emily's future. I remember sitting in her office discussing the various ways to structure the gift and her insistence on including certain reversionary provisions. She had said, "Dorothy, I understand that you want to help your daughter, but I've seen too many cases where family generosity gets taken for granted or abused. I'm going to recommend some reversionary provisions that will protect you if circumstances change." At the time, I had protested that such protections wouldn't be necessary. Emily would never take advantage of me. Our relationship was strong, built on mutual love and respect.
The idea that I might someday need legal recourse against my own daughter seemed impossible. But Susan had been insistent. She had said, "Think of it as insurance. You hope you'll never need it, but you'll be grateful it's there if circumstances change." The gift deed included several specific conditions. Emily and Brandon could live in the house as long as they maintained it properly, paid the taxes and insurance, and most importantly, provided appropriate care and support for me if I ever needed it due to age or health issues. If those conditions were violated, I retained the right to revoke the gift and reclaim the property. I had never mentioned these provisions to Emily and Brandon, seeing no reason to burden them with legal technicalities when I was confident they would never become relevant. The deed was filed with the county, the house was officially theirs, and I had trusted that our family bond would ensure I would always be treated with love and respect.
Now, lying in their guest room while they laughed at comedy movies in the next room, completely unconcerned about the woman who had given them everything, I began to understand why Susan had been so insistent on those protective clauses. But before I could do anything about the legal situation, I needed to be absolutely certain about what I was dealing with. I needed to test them one more time, to give them a clear opportunity to show me that I was wrong about their true feelings, that they were capable of treating me with basic human decency. The next morning, I got my answer. I had spent the night in considerable pain, unable to find a comfortable position that didn't put pressure on my healing incision. By morning, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and feeling worse than I had since leaving the hospital. When I emerged from the guest room around 10 a.m., Emily and Brandon were both in the living room, she working on her laptop, and he scrolling through his phone. "Good morning," I said quietly. They both glanced up briefly, mumbled greetings, and returned to their screens. I stood there for a moment, gathering my courage, then decided to give them one final chance to show me who they really were. "I had a really rough night," I said. "I'm feeling pretty weak this morning, and I'm supposed to stay hydrated. Would one of you mind bringing me a glass of water?" The request was simple, reasonable, and exactly the kind of basic assistance that any caring family member would provide without question to someone recovering from major surgery. Emily didn't even look up from her laptop. "There's a kitchen right there, Mom. You know where the glasses are." "I'm having trouble standing for very long," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It would really help if—" "Oh my God," Brandon interrupted, finally looking up from his phone with an expression of pure irritation. "Are you serious right now? You want us to wait on you because you can't walk 10 feet to get water?" "It's not about walking 10 feet. It's about the fact that I'm recovering from major surgery, and I asked for help with something that would take you 30 seconds to do." Emily finally closed her laptop and turned to face me with that same cold expression I had seen in the kitchen the day before. "Mom," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you need to stop acting like you're dying. It was stomach surgery. People have stomach surgery all the time. You're being completely dramatic about this whole thing." "Dramatic?" I repeated, hardly believing what I was hearing. "Yes, dramatic," Emily continued. "You're acting like you're completely helpless when you're obviously fine enough to walk around and complain all the time." Brandon nodded emphatically. "Seriously, Dorothy, this whole helpless act is getting really old. We have our own lives to live." "Helpless act?" The words came out louder than I intended, fueled by a week of accumulated hurt and disbelief. "Come on," Emily said, rolling her eyes. "You're milking this surgery thing for all it's worth, acting like you can't do anything for yourself, so we have to take care of you like you're a child." That was it. That was the moment when any lingering doubt I had about their true character completely evaporated. These people who lived in a house I had bought for them, who had benefited from hundreds of thousands of dollars of my generosity over the years, who owed their entire comfortable lifestyle to my sacrifice, were treating me like a burden for asking for basic assistance while recovering from major surgery. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady, despite the rage building inside me. "You're absolutely right. I should stop asking you for help." Emily looked satisfied, as if she had finally gotten through to me. "I'm glad you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly. I understand exactly who you are and exactly how you feel about me. I turned and walked back to the guest room, moving as quickly as my healing body would allow. But instead of collapsing in defeat like they probably expected, I began planning the most satisfying lesson in gratitude they would ever receive. What happened next proved beyond any doubt that Emily and Brandon weren't just selfish and ungrateful. They were genuinely cruel people who would go to extraordinary lengths to maintain their comfortable situation at my expense. Over the next 2 days, I made no requests for help. I struggled through basic tasks on my own, moving slowly and carefully, taking frequent breaks when the pain became overwhelming. I got my own water, made my own simple meals, and kept myself to myself in the guest room. I wanted to see if removing myself from their daily routine would improve their attitude or maybe even prompt them to check on my well-being. It didn't. If anything, my self-sufficiency seemed to make them more relaxed and dismissive. They resumed their normal routines as if I weren't there at all, talking and laughing in the common areas, ordering takeout for themselves without offering to include me, and generally behaving as if the woman recovering from major surgery in their guest room was invisible. But on the 10th day of my stay, something in my demeanor must have changed. Maybe it was the way that I had stopped asking for anything. Maybe it was how I had become quiet and observant instead of hurt and pleading. Or maybe they simply sensed that their cruelty had pushed me past some invisible threshold. Whatever it was, they began to watch me more carefully, whispering to each other when they thought I couldn't hear, and exchanging glances that suggested they were planning something. I found out what that something was on the evening when I quietly mentioned that I might need to call my lawyer about some paperwork related to my medical leave. I hadn't been specific about what kind of paperwork, and certainly hadn't mentioned anything about the house or the gift deed. I was simply thinking out loud about the various administrative tasks that pile up when you're dealing with a medical crisis. But the effect on Emily and Brandon was immediate and dramatic. "Your lawyer?" Emily asked, her voice sharp with sudden attention. "What do you need to talk to a lawyer about?" "Just some paperwork, medical leave documentation, insurance claims, that sort of thing." But I could see them exchanging those looks again, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who share secrets and schemes. That night, I went to bed early, exhausted from another day of managing my recovery without support. But I was awakened around midnight by the sound of voices in the hallway outside my room. Emily and Brandon were having intense whispered conversation, and while I couldn't make out all the words, I heard enough to understand that they were worried about something. I heard lawyer and paperwork and can't let her before their voices moved away from my door. The next morning, I discovered what they had decided to do about their concerns. I woke up around 7 a.m., feeling slightly better than I had in days. The pain was more manageable, and I was starting to regain some of my strength. I decided to get up early and maybe sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, something that felt almost normal. But when I tried to open the bedroom door, it wouldn't budge. At first, I thought it was stuck. Old houses sometimes have doors that swell and become difficult to open. I tried again, putting more pressure on the handle, but the door was definitely locked from the outside. I stood there for a moment processing what this meant. Emily and Brandon had locked me in the guest room like a prisoner. I tried the door again, this time calling out, "Emily? Brandon? The door seems to be stuck." No response. I waited a few minutes, then tried again, louder this time. "Hello? Could someone help me with this door?" Still nothing. I began to feel the first stirrings of real panic. Being locked in a room when you're recovering from surgery, when you need access to medication and food and basic facilities, wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. I spent the next hour trying everything I could think of. I knocked on the door, called their names, even tried to see if I could somehow manipulate the lock from inside. Nothing worked. The door was solid, the lock was secure, and Emily and Brandon were either not home or were deliberately ignoring my calls for help. By 9 a.m., I was genuinely frightened. I had missed my morning dose of pain medication, I was getting hungry, and I needed to use the bathroom. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that this wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act designed to control and isolate me. That's when I remembered the window. The guest room had a large window that faced the side yard, and I could see my neighbor, George Miller, working in his garden. George was a retired teacher in his 70s, a kind man who had always been friendly during my visits to Emily and Brandon's house. I managed to open the window and call out to him, "George, George, could you help me?" He looked up, surprised to see me calling from a second-story window. "Dorothy? What's wrong?" "I'm locked in this room," I called back, trying to keep my voice calm. "Emily and Brandon seem to have left, and I can't get out. Could you possibly call the police for me?" George looked concerned and confused, but he nodded. "Of course. Are you hurt? Do you need an ambulance?" "I don't think so, but I'm recovering from surgery, and I need to get out of here." 20 minutes later, I heard sirens in the driveway. 2 police officers arrived, and I could hear them talking to someone downstairs. To my surprise, Emily and Brandon were apparently home after all. They had simply been ignoring my calls for help. From my window, I could hear Emily's voice, sweet and concerned, explaining to the officers that I was confused from my surgery medication and had somehow gotten the door stuck. She led them upstairs, and I heard the lock clicking as someone opened the door from the outside. "Mrs. Hayes," one of the officers said as I emerged from the room, "are you all right?" I looked at Emily, who was standing behind the officers with an expression of perfectly performed concern. "I'm fine now," I said carefully. "Thank you for coming." "Your daughter says you might be a bit disoriented from your medication. That's pretty common after surgery. She was worried when she found the door locked from the inside." I stared at Emily, understanding immediately what had happened. She had unlocked the door just before the police arrived and was now claiming that I had somehow locked myself in by accident. "I see," I said slowly. "We're just glad you're safe," Emily said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I was so worried when I heard you calling. I think the door handle must have malfunctioned somehow." The officers seemed satisfied with this explanation. There was no sign of harm, no evidence of wrongdoing, and Emily's performance was convincing. They gave me their card, reminded me to be careful with my medication, and left. As soon as the front door closed behind them, Emily's mask of concern disappeared completely. "What the hell were you thinking? Calling the police? Are you completely insane?" "I was locked in that room for 3 hours," I said quietly. "The door was stuck," Emily said. "Doors get stuck sometimes. That's not a reason to create a scene and get the neighbors involved." But I had seen the lock. I knew the difference between a stuck door and a locked door. And I had heard their whispered conversation the night before about not letting me do something. They were escalating their cruelty, moving from neglect and verbal abuse to actual imprisonment. And they were willing to lie to the police to cover their tracks. That's when I knew I was dealing with people who would stop at nothing to maintain their comfortable situation, even if it meant psychologically and physically abusing the woman who had given them everything. But they had made one crucial mistake. In their panic about my mention of calling a lawyer, in their decision to lock me up to prevent me from taking action, they had shown me exactly what they were capable of. And they had no idea that I was about to show them what I was capable of in return. The next morning brought me the clarity and determination I needed to take action. I had spent the night in that guest room, the same room where they had imprisoned me, thinking about the legal documents sitting in the filing cabinet at my apartment, thinking about Susan Delaney's warnings about family members who take advantage of generosity, and thinking about the life insurance money that had made it all possible. Emily and Brandon had shown me their true nature in the most dramatic way possible. They weren't just ungrateful or selfish. They were actively malicious. They were willing to lock me up, lie to police officers, and psychologically torment a woman recovering from major surgery in order to maintain their comfortable lifestyle without any inconvenient obligations. But they had made one crucial mistake. In their panic about my mention of calling a lawyer, in their decision to lock me up to prevent me from taking action, they had shown me exactly what they were capable of. And they had no idea that I was about to show them what I was capable of in return. The next morning brought me the clarity and determination I needed to take action. I had spent the night in that guest room, the same room where they had imprisoned me. I gathered my purse, my medication, and the few personal items I had brought with me. I opened the window as quietly as possible and carefully climbed out onto the porch roof. The drop to the ground was about 8 feet, manageable if I was careful about how I landed. The descent was terrifying and painful, but I made it without serious injury. I walked slowly through the early morning streets to the nearest bus stop, took the city bus to the downtown area, and arrived at Susan Delaney's law office just as she was unlocking the front door. "Dorothy?" Susan said, looking surprised and concerned. "What are you doing here so early? And why do you look like you've been through a war?" I followed her into her office and told her everything. The surgery, the recovery at Emily and Brandon's house, their escalating cruelty, the imprisonment, the lies to the police. I watched Susan's expression grow more appalled with each detail. "And these are the people you gave a house to?" Susan asked when I finished. "These are the people I gave a house to," I confirmed. Susan was quiet for a moment, processing what I had told her. Then she walked to her filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder. "Dorothy," she said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. Do you remember the reversionary clauses we included in the gift deed?" "Vaguely," I admitted. "You said they were like insurance." "They were. And based on what you've just told me, Emily and Brandon have violated every single condition of the gift." She opened the folder and pulled out a copy of the deed. "Look at Section 7, subsection C." I read the legal language, which basically stated that the gift was conditional on the recipients providing appropriate care and support for me if I ever needed it due to health issues, and that failure to meet this obligation would result in automatic revocation of the gift. "They've been doing the opposite of providing care and support," Susan said. "They've been actively abusing and endangering you. That's not just a violation of the gift conditions, it's potentially criminal." "So what does that mean?" I asked. Susan smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested justice was about to be served. "It means, Dorothy, that house was never really theirs. It was yours, held in trust for them as long as they honored their obligations to you. They've broken that trust in the most dramatic way possible." She pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "I can have revocation papers prepared and filed with the county by this afternoon. I can also have an eviction notice served by tomorrow morning." How long would they have to leave? For a violation this severe, I'd recommend 7 days. That's generous, considering they've been abusing you. I sat in Susan's office, looking at the legal documents that would restore my home and my dignity, and felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Power. I said, "Do it." The legal papers were served the next morning, while I waited in Susan's office, knowing that Emily and Brandon were probably panicking about my disappearance. The process server called to confirm that the documents had been delivered and that both recipients were present and had been informed of the 7-day eviction timeline.
How did they react? Susan asked. The young woman became hysterical, lots of crying and shouting. The young man just kept saying, "This can't be legal," over and over again. An hour later, my phone started ringing. Emily's number appeared on the screen, and I could see that she had been trying to call me repeatedly since the papers were served. "Should I answer?" I asked Susan. "Absolutely," Susan said, "but put it on speaker. I want to hear this." I answered the call, and Emily's voice came through the speaker like a hurricane of panic and rage. "Mom, what the hell is this? What are these papers? You can't just kick us out of our house." "Hello, Emily," I said calmly. "I trust you received the legal documents." "This is insane! You can't do this! This is our house! You gave it to us!" "I gave it to you conditionally, and you violated every single condition." "What conditions? What are you talking about?" Susan leaned toward the phone. "Miss Hayes, this is Susan Delaney, your mother's attorney. The gift deed included specific provisions requiring you to provide appropriate care and support for your mother if she ever needed it due to health issues. And locking her in a room, denying her basic assistance during her recovery from surgery, and lying to police officers constitutes a material breach of those conditions." There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. We didn't lock her in a room," Emily said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "We have a witness who heard your mother calling for help. We also have documentation of your failure to provide adequate care during her recovery period." "This is ridiculous," Brandon's voice came through the speaker now. "She was fine. She was just being dramatic about some minor surgery." "Minor surgery?" I said, my voice rising slightly. "Brandon, they removed a tumor the size of a grapefruit from my abdomen. The incision was 6 inches long. I couldn't bend, lift, or drive for weeks. And when I asked for a glass of water, you told me I was being dramatic." "We had our own lives to live," Emily said, her voice becoming defensive. "We couldn't drop everything to wait on you." "Wait on me?" I repeated. "Emily, I asked for basic assistance while recovering from major surgery in the house that I bought for you with money from your father's life insurance policy." There was another silence, this one longer. "Dad's life insurance?" Emily said finally, her voice small. "Did you think I bought you a $380,000 house with my salary from the animal shelter? Every penny of that down payment came from the life insurance money your father left to take care of us." I could hear Emily crying now, but I felt no sympathy. These were the tears of someone who had been caught, not someone who was genuinely sorry. "Mom, please," Emily said between sobs. "We're sorry. We didn't understand. We'll do better. You can't just throw us out with nowhere to go." "You have 7 days to find somewhere to go. The same 7 days you spent treating me like a burden while I recovered from surgery in the house that I bought for you." "But where will we live?" Brandon asked, panic evident in his voice. "I don't know, Brandon," I said. "Maybe you can ask your parents, or maybe you can figure out how to support yourselves like adults instead of living off the generosity of the woman who you've been abusing."
"We can't afford rent anywhere," Emily wailed. "Our credit isn't good enough. We don't have savings." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to treat me like garbage," I said. Oh my goodness, if you're loving this epic revenge as much as I am, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because you do not want to miss our next incredible story. That evening, I returned to what was once again my house. Emily and Brandon were there, surrounded by boxes and looking like their world had collapsed around them. When I walked through the front door, they both stared at me as if I were a ghost. "We need to talk,"
Emily said, her eyes red from crying. I think we've talked enough, I said, setting my purse down on the kitchen counter. Mom, please, Emily said. I know we messed up, but this is our home. We've lived here for 5 years. You can't just take it away because we weren't perfect caregivers. Perfect caregivers, I repeated. Emily, you locked me in a room. You told police officers I was confused from medication. You called me dramatic for asking for help after major surgery. You treated me like a servant in the house I bought for you. We're sorry, Brandon said. We really are. We were stressed and we handled it badly, but we're family. Family forgives each other. I looked at these two people who had systematically abused and humiliated me for over a week and decided they deserved to understand the full scope of what they had lost. Do you want to know about that money, Emily? I asked. The money I used to buy this house? Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. Your father had a $550,000 life insurance policy. When he died, I could have used that money for anything. I could have bought myself a beautiful house. I could have traveled the world. I could have invested it and retired comfortably. I walked into the living room and sat down in the chair that had once been my favorite spot when this was my home. Instead, I used every penny of it on you. Your college education cost $120,000. Your wedding cost $35,000. The various business ventures and emergencies I bailed you out of over the years cost another $15,000. And this house cost $380,000. I could see Emily doing the math in her head. That's $550,000, I continued. Every single dollar your father left to take care of us, I spent it all on making sure you had a good life. We didn't know, Emily whispered. Of course you didn't know, because I never wanted you to feel burdened by the sacrifice your father and I made for you. I wanted you to feel loved and supported, not obligated. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard that Robert and I had dreamed of having someday. But you know what I learned this week? I said. Love and sacrifice don't automatically create gratitude. Sometimes they create entitlement. Sometimes they create people who think they deserve everything they've been given and owe nothing in return. That's not true, Emily said. We're grateful. We've always been grateful. Are you? I asked, turning to face her. When I needed basic care after surgery, you told me I was being dramatic. When I asked for a glass of water, you said you weren't my servant. When I mentioned calling my lawyer, you locked me in a room like a prisoner. We were scared, Brandon said. We thought you might try to take the house back. And why were you scared of that? If you were such wonderful, grateful children who had taken good care of me, why would you be worried about me talking to a lawyer? Neither of them had an answer for that. You were scared because you knew you had been treating me badly. You knew you weren't holding up the end of the arrangement. You knew that if anyone looked closely at how you had been treating the woman who gave you everything, it wouldn't look good. I walked to the front door and opened it. You have 6 more days. I suggest you use them wisely. Over the next few days, Emily and Brandon tried every manipulation tactic in the book. They alternated between tearful apologies, angry accusations, and desperate bargaining attempts. Emily showed up at my temporary hotel room with flowers and a card that read, "World's Best Mom." She cried and begged and promised that things would be different if she would just give them another chance. She talked about how much they loved the house, how they made so many memories there, how it wouldn't be fair to take away their home over a misunderstanding.
Brandon tried a different approach, appealing to my sense of family obligation and suggesting that I was being vindictive and cruel. This isn't like you, Dorothy. You've always been the kind of person who puts family first. Don't let anger make you do something you'll regret. They offered to pay rent, though they couldn't explain where they'd get the money. They promised to take better care of me if I ever needed help again, though their promises rang hollow after what I had experienced. They even suggested family therapy, as if their treatment of me was something that could be fixed with a few counseling sessions. But the most revealing moment came when Emily tried to argue that taking the house back was unfair because they had invested in it. "We've put so much work into this place," she said. "We painted the bedrooms, we landscaped the backyard, we updated the bathroom fixtures. Those improvements increase the value. You can't just ignore our contributions." I stared at her, amazed by the audacity of someone who was trying to claim partial ownership of a house based on basic maintenance and minor improvements. "Emily," I said slowly, "you're talking about maybe $5,000 worth of paint and plants. I'm talking about $380,000 that I spent to buy you that house, plus 5 years of property taxes, homeowners insurance, and major repairs that I've been paying for without you even knowing it." Her face went white. "What do you mean you've been paying the taxes and insurance? Did you think those bills just magically paid themselves? I've been covering the property taxes and insurance from the beginning. I didn't want you to have to worry about them." The look of shock and shame on Emily's face told me that she had never even thought about these expenses. She had been living in a house, rent-free, utilities-free, and tax-free for 5 years, without ever considering who was making that possible. "How much?" she whispered. "About $4,000 a year. So that's another $20,000 over the past 5 years. Emily sat down heavily in her hotel room chair, finally beginning to understand the true scope of what she was losing. "But even if you've been helping with expenses, this is still our home. We've been living here for 5 years. Doesn't that count for something?"
"It would," I said, "if you had honored the agreement that made it possible for you to live there. But you didn't. You treated me like garbage when I needed help, and then you locked me in a room when you thought I might do something about it." "We panicked," Emily said. "We made a mistake." "You made a choice," I corrected. "You chose to be cruel instead of kind. You chose to be selfish instead of grateful. You chose to see me as a burden instead of as the person who made your comfortable life possible." As the eviction deadline approached, Emily and Brandon became increasingly desperate. They had apparently been calling rental agencies and apartment complexes, only to discover what many young adults learned too late. When you've been living rent-free in a house someone else owns, you don't build the credit history and savings necessary to easily transition to independent living. Their credit scores were poor because they had never needed to manage significant monthly housing payments. Their savings were non-existent because they had been able to live comfortably on their modest incomes without the burden of rent or mortgage payments. References were difficult to obtain because they had never been tenants anywhere. "Everything is so expensive," Emily complained during one of her increasingly frantic phone calls. "A decent apartment costs $1,800 a month, and they want first month, last month, and a security deposit up front. That's almost $6,000 just to move in." "Welcome to the real world," I said, unsympathetically. "The world that most people your age live in." "But we can't afford that," Emily said. "Our combined income is only about $3,500 a month." "Then you'll need to find something less expensive," I said, "or get better jobs, or maybe ask Brandon's parents for help, since they've never contributed to your housing costs." "His parents don't have any money," Emily said. "Neither do most parents.
but somehow their children managed to figure out how to support themselves. On the 6th day, Emily called me crying hysterically. "Mom, we can't find anywhere to live," she sobbed. "Everything is too expensive or they won't accept our application. We're going to be homeless." "You're not going to be homeless," I said calmly. "You're going to figure out how to be adults." "But where will we go?" "I don't know, Emily. Where do other people go when they need housing they can afford? Maybe you'll rent a room from someone. Maybe you'll find a smaller apartment in a different area. Maybe you'll move in with friends temporarily. Maybe Brandon will finally get a real job that pays enough to support a family." "This is so unfair," Emily said. "We've been living here for 5 years. This is our home." "No," I said firmly. "This is my home. It was always my home. I let you live here as long as you were worthy of that privilege. You proved that you weren't." On the 7th and final day, I arrived at the house to find Emily and Brandon loading boxes into a small U-Haul truck. They had apparently found a tiny 2-bedroom apartment about an hour away, in a much less desirable area, but it was what they could afford on short notice. Emily was still crying as she carried boxes to the truck. Brandon looked angry and defeated, slamming items around with unnecessary force. "I hope you're happy," Brandon said when he saw me. "You've destroyed our lives over a stupid misunderstanding." "I've corrected a mistake. The mistake was thinking that generosity would automatically create gratitude and good character." Emily approached me with the house keys in her trembling hand. "Mom, I really am sorry. I know we handled everything wrong. I know we hurt you. Is there possibility that we could work something out? Maybe we could pay rent. Maybe we could sign some kind of agreement about taking care of you." I looked at my daughter, this woman I had raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally, who had locked me in a room when I was recovering from surgery, and felt a profound sadness about what our relationship had become. "Emily," I said gently, "trust is like a beautiful vase. Once it's broken, you can glue it back together, but it will never be the same. You broke something between us that can't be fixed with promises or agreements." She pressed the keys into my hand, and I felt the weight of them. Not just the physical weight, but the symbolic weight of reclaiming my home and my dignity. "Where will you go from here?" I asked, not out of concern, but out of curiosity. "We found a small apartment," Emily said. "It's not much, but it's what we can afford on short notice. Brandon's going to look for full-time work, and I'm going to try to get a second job." "That sounds like a good plan," I said. "Learning to support yourselves will be good for both of you." They finished loading the truck in silence. As they prepared to drive away, Emily rolled down the window for one last attempt. "Mom," she called out, "will you at least consider, someday, maybe we could have a relationship again?" I thought about that question as I watched them drive away. Could I forgive them? Possibly, with time. Could I trust them again? Probably not. Could I ever forget the way they treated me when I was vulnerable and needed their help? Definitely not. That evening, I walked through my house alone for the first time in 5 years. The rooms felt different, both familiar and strange, like visiting a childhood home as an adult. Emily and Brandon had left the place clean and undamaged, which I appreciated, but they had also removed all traces of their lives there, leaving it feeling empty and echoing. I stood in the kitchen, where I was told I was being dramatic for asking for water after surgery. I sat in the living room where they dismissed my recovery as a minor inconvenience. I looked at the guest room where they had locked me in like a prisoner. But instead of feeling angry or bitter, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the tense silence of living with people who resented my presence. The rooms were empty, but they were full of possibility rather than hostility. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe and welcome in my own space. I called Susan Delaney to let her know that the eviction had been completed successfully. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Relieved and grateful that you insisted on those protective clauses. I've been practicing law for 30 years. I've seen too many generous people get taken advantage of by their own family members. People assume that love and genetics will protect them, but sometimes legal documents are the only things that actually work. Have you ever seen anything like what Emily and Brandon did? Locking you in a room? That's extreme, even for ungrateful adult children. Most of them stick to emotional manipulation and financial guilt trips. The physical imprisonment was genuinely shocking. I keep wondering if I did something wrong, if I gave them too much, or if I didn't teach them the right values, or if I somehow created this sense of entitlement."
Dorothy, Susan said firmly, you gave your daughter every advantage you could provide. You supported her education, her wedding, her housing, her husband's failed business ventures. You asked for almost nothing in return except basic human decency during a medical crisis. Their response to that was abuse and imprisonment. That's not about how you raised them, that's about who they chose to become. Over the next few months, I slowly reclaimed my home and rebuilt my life. I moved my belongings back into the master bedroom that had been mine when Robert was alive. I rearranged the furniture to suit my preferences instead of Emily and Brandon's. I painted the walls colors that made me happy. I planted flowers in the garden that Robert and I had planned together years earlier. Most importantly, I began to heal, not just from the surgery, but from the emotional trauma of discovering what my daughter was truly capable of. I started hosting my book club at the house, something I hadn't done in years. I invited my neighbors over for coffee and discovered that several of them had been concerned about me during Emily and Brandon's residency, having noticed that I seemed sad and withdrawn during my visits. "We always wondered why you looked so uncomfortable in your own house," George Miller said during one of our coffee visits. "It seemed like they treated you more like an unwelcome guest than family." "They did," I said, but I kept making excuses for their behavior because they were family. "Family should treat you better, not worse," George's wife Margaret said. "The people who love you should be the ones who make you feel most welcome and valued." I also began to date again, something I hadn't done since Robert's death. A man named Frank, a retired engineer who volunteered at the animal shelter where I worked, asked me to dinner one evening. When I told him about the house situation and my recent experiences with Emily and Brandon, his reaction was immediate and clear. "You locked you in a room?" he said, his voice rising with indignation. "Dorothy, that's not just ungrateful, that's abusive. You were right to reclaim your home." It was validating to hear that reaction from someone outside the situation, someone who wasn't emotionally invested in preserving family relationships at any cost. Emily called occasionally during those first few months, usually when she and Brandon were facing some new financial challenge in their apartment. The conversations were stilted and uncomfortable, with Emily clearly hoping I would offer to help while being afraid to ask directly. "How are you adjusting to the apartment?" I would ask. "It's really small, and the neighborhood isn't great, and the rent is so expensive that we can barely afford groceries." "That sounds challenging," I would respond, neutrally. "Yeah, it's just really hard to start over like this. Everything costs so much more than we realized." Most people learn to budget and prioritize when they're responsible for their own housing costs. It's a good life skill to develop. Emily would usually end these calls quickly when it became clear that I wasn't going to offer financial assistance or express sympathy for their self-created difficulties. Brandon never called at all, which didn't surprise me. He had always been the type of person who disappeared when things became difficult or when he couldn't get what he wanted from a situation. A year after reclaiming my house,
I received a surprising phone call from Emily. Her voice sounded different, more mature, more thoughtful, less demanding. Mom, I wanted to call and tell you something. Brandon and I are getting divorced. I'm sorry to hear that, though I wasn't particularly surprised. I've been thinking a lot over the past year about what happened between us, about how we treated you, about the choices I made. And what have you concluded? I asked. I concluded that we were horrible to you, Emily said, her voice shaking slightly. Not just inconsiderate or stressed or overwhelmed, actually horrible. We treated you like garbage when you needed help, and then we tried to imprison you when we thought you might stand up for yourself. Yes, I said simply. You did. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what we did wrong, and I'm ashamed of the person I was during that time. What changed? I asked. Living in the real world, Emily said with a bitter laugh. Paying rent and utilities and groceries on our own income, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, having Brandon blame me when his latest get-rich-quick scheme failed and we couldn't make rent, realizing that the comfortable life we had been living was entirely because of your generosity, not because we were successful or smart or deserving. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. I kept thinking about that glass of water. You asked for a glass of water after major surgery, and I told you weren't our servants. Mom, you gave us everything. You bought us a house with Dad's life insurance money. You paid our taxes and insurance for 5 years. You bailed us out every time we had financial problems. And when you asked for basic human kindness during your recovery, I treated you like you were asking for the world. Yes, I said again. You did. I understand if you never want to see me again. I understand if you can't forgive what we did to you. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what we lost. It wasn't just the house. It was you. It was the best mother anyone could ask for, and we threw it away because we felt entitled to everything and grateful for nothing. I sat in my kitchen, in my house, listening to my daughter finally acknowledge the truth of what had happened between us. Emily, I said slowly, I appreciate you calling to say this. I appreciate that you've learned something from this experience. But, she asked, clearly hearing the reservation in my voice, but understanding what you did wrong doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't erase the memory of being locked in a room when I was recovering from surgery. It doesn't take away the pain of being treated like a burden by the person I loved most in the world. I know, she whispered. I know it doesn't. And it doesn't give me any confidence that you wouldn't do the same thing again if circumstances were different. If you inherited money, if you didn't need to work 2 jobs, if life became comfortable again, would you remember this lesson? Or would you go back to feeling entitled to everything and grateful for nothing? Emily was quiet for a long moment. She said, I don't know. Finally, I hope I would remember, but I understand why you wouldn't trust that. I'm glad you called. I'm glad you've learned something from this experience. But Emily, some damage can't be repaired. Some trust can't be rebuilt. Some relationships can't be restored, no matter how sorry someone becomes afterward. I understand. Emily?
Yes. Are you happy? In the house, I mean. Are you happy there? I looked around my bright, peaceful kitchen, thought about the book club meeting I was hosting that evening, thought about my dinner date with Frank the following night, thought about the garden I was planning for spring. Yes, I said, I'm very happy. Good, Emily said. That's what matters. That's what should have mattered all along. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while thinking about forgiveness and consequences
and the difference between understanding and excusing someone's behavior. Emily's apology was genuine, and her newfound understanding was real, but it didn't change the fundamental truth. Some actions have permanent consequences. 2 years have passed since I reclaimed my house and my dignity. Emily and I occasionally exchanged text messages on holidays, brief, polite exchanges that acknowledge our shared history, without pretending that our relationship can return to what it once was. She's apparently doing better financially, working as a marketing manager for a small company and living in a decent apartment on her own. Brandon, according to Emily, moved back in with his parents after their divorce and is still chasing his various get-rich-quick schemes. I've learned several important lessons from this experience, lessons I wish I had understood earlier in my life. First, generosity without boundaries creates entitlement, not gratitude. When you give someone everything they want without requiring anything in return, you don't create a loving, appreciative person. You create someone who sees your sacrifices as their due, who takes your kindness for granted, and who resents any suggestion that they owe you even basic respect in return. Second, family relationships require the same standards of decency and respect as any other relationship. Blood relation doesn't excuse abuse, manipulation, or cruelty. Being someone's mother doesn't mean you have to accept being treated poorly. Being someone's daughter doesn't give you license to treat your parents like servants or burdens. Third, legal protections matter, even in family relationships. Susan Delaney's insistence on protective clauses in the gift deed saved me from losing everything to people who would have taken advantage of my generosity indefinitely. Love and trust are beautiful things, but legal documents provide the backup plan you hope you'll never need. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity and demand the respect you deserve. At 68, after major surgery, while recovering from emotional trauma, I still had the strength to stand up for myself and take back what was rightfully mine. My life now is quiet but fulfilling. I have genuine friends who appreciate my company, not people who tolerate my presence in exchange for financial benefits. I have a romantic relationship with someone who treats me as an equal partner, not someone who sees me as a source of free housing and financial support. I have a home that feels peaceful and welcoming, not tense and hostile. Most evenings, I sit in my living room, the same living room where Emily told me we weren't her servants, and I feel grateful. Not grateful for the painful lesson I learned about my daughter's character, but grateful that I had the courage to act on what I learned. If you're listening to this story and you recognize yourself in Emily and Brandon's behavior, I hope you'll take a hard look at the people in your life who have been generous to you. Your parents, your grandparents, your mentors, your friends, the people who have given you opportunities, support, and assistance over the years. Ask yourself, am I treating these people with the respect and gratitude they deserve? Am I taking their kindness for granted? Am I prepared to step up and provide care and support when they need it? And if you recognize yourself in my situation, if you're someone who has been generous to family members who now treat you poorly, I want you to know that you have more power than you realize. You don't have to accept abuse or disrespect in the name of family harmony. You don't have to sacrifice your dignity to maintain relationships with people who don't value you. You don't have to continue giving to people who take everything and appreciate nothing. It's never too late to set boundaries. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to reclaim what's rightfully yours.